Cemetery of Lost Souls. The night was unnaturally dark. The stars hid behind thick clouds, and the moon seemed to deliberately avoid illuminating the path for the two travelers heading toward a place where, according to rumors, death comes to life. Felipe and Ronnie, renowned video bloggers, explored eerie locations in search of paranormal phenomena. They had heard legends about this cemetery, nameless graves, strange voices in the night, ghosts wandering among the old tombstones. "Are you sure you want to do this?" Ronnie asked, stopping in front of the rusty gate. "Of course, this will be our best footage yet," Felipe replied, turning on the camera. The moment they stepped across the cemetery's threshold, everything changed. The wind, which just moments ago barely rustled the branches of the trees, suddenly died down. The darkness grew even denser, and the air became heavy with the scent of dampness, mixed with something else, something rotten, ancient, impossible to describe, and then a loud rustling sound. "Did you hear that?" Ronnie whispered, clutching his flashlight. Felipe nodded and aimed the camera into the darkness. Blurred silhouettes flickered on the screen, but when they turned their heads in that direction, there was nothing there. "Maybe it's just the wind," Ronnie muttered uncertainly, though the wind hadn't blown for the past 5 minutes. A faint whisper drifted from deep within the cemetery. It had no source, no language, yet it was here. Close. From behind the leaning crosses, a figure slowly emerged. It did not walk. It floated above the ground. Its eyes, black abysses, stared straight at them. Ronnie grabbed Felipe's arm. "We need to get out of here." But when they turned around, the gates were shut. Behind them the rustling came again. Felipe slowly turned the camera and saw that they were no longer alone. Felipe gripped the camera tighter, as if it could somehow be their only salvation. On the screen, pale silhouettes flickered, standing motionless among the graves. Until he blinked, Ronnie frantically yanked at the gate doors. In vain. They hadn't just closed. They seemed as if they had never been open at all. "This is impossible," he rasped, feeling his heart pounding violently in his chest. Felipe slowly turned the camera back into the darkness. The silhouettes were no longer standing still. They were approaching, slowly, silently, as if carrying a piece of the darkness that smothered the sky. "Run!" Felipe shouted. They dashed forward, weaving through tilted tombstones and dust-covered monuments, desperately trying to escape the unseen terror. But the faster they ran, the thicker the air became. It felt as though the darkness itself was tightening around them, squeezing out space, stealing their breath. Suddenly, Felipe stumbled over something and crashed to the ground. Ronnie helped him up, but when he looked down, his blood ran cold. He had tripped over a human hand, sticking out of the earth, and the worst part, it was moving. Muffled moans rose from beneath the soil. All around the cemetery, something was stirring, clawing, gnawing, forcing its way to the surface. The ground was breathing. "God, what is this?" Ronnie gasped. Then a blood-curdling scream tore through the night air. It came from everywhere at once, as if the cemetery itself had unleashed it. A flash of lightning illuminated the grounds for a split second, and they saw. The figures, once mere shadowy silhouettes, now stood terrifyingly close. Their faces were twisted, their hollow eyes gleaming with a deathly whiteness. Some had no lips, only skeletal jaws twitching in a silent, grotesque laughter. Ronnie raised his flashlight, shining it directly into the face of the nearest entity. But the light did not drive away the darkness. It only made them more horrifying. "We have to find another way out," Felipe shouted. They ran blindly, choosing a direction at random. But the more they moved, the more they felt that this place was changing. The trees had vanished. The tombstones no longer stood in orderly rows, but were scattered chaotically, as if something had thrown them around. "Something's wrong. This isn't the right path," Ronnie gasped, struggling to catch his breath. Felipe suddenly stopped and looked around. "We're going in circles," he whispered. Ronnie didn't have time to respond before a cold hand gripped his shoulder. He turned and saw one of those faceless figures standing right behind him, and in that instant, everything went black. Darkness swallowed everything. Felipe felt his heart pounding violently in his chest, his lungs tightening from the lack of air. He knew Ronnie was somewhere nearby, but he couldn't see him, couldn't even hear him. "Ronnie!" he called out hoarsely, but his voice sounded muffled, as if the night itself had absorbed it. Suddenly, something brushed against his arm, cold, sticky, inhuman. He yanked away, but it didn't disappear. It rustled around him like hundreds of unseen fingers gliding through the air, searching for a new victim. The flashlight. Felipe fumbled desperately for the switch, and the moment he pressed it, a narrow beam of light cut through the darkness. And there they were. Hundreds. No. Thousands. Faceless phantoms, standing in rows, their hands reaching toward him. They were translucent, yet solid, as if made from condensed shadow. Some still had remnants of faces, their features dissolving like ashes scattered by the wind. They trembled, starving, waiting for his mistake. "Felipe." A whisper shattered the silence. Felipe spun around and saw Ronnie. He stood just a few steps away, his eyes wide with terror. Wordlessly, he lifted a trembling hand and pointed behind his friend. Felipe turned his head slowly and met the gaze of the most horrifying creature of them all. It loomed over him, black as an abyss, its eyes, two blood-red voids with no end. It had no mouth, yet he could feel it smiling. And then it spoke. "You will not leave this place." The voice didn't echo in his ears. It rang inside his skull, drilling into his mind, freezing the blood in his veins. Ronnie screamed, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the air itself. The space around them buzzed, as if reality was vibrating. "Run!" Felipe grabbed his friend's arm, and they bolted, without direction, without thought. The phantoms followed. They didn't run, didn't glide. They simply appeared, closer and closer with each flicker of light. Suddenly a chapel emerged in the distance, old, crumbling, its walls blackened with time. The door was slightly ajar. "Inside!" Ronnie shouted. They lunged for the entrance, throwing themselves inside, and slammed the doors shut behind them. Silence. Felipe gasped for breath, trying to steady himself. Ronnie pressed into a corner, wiping the sweat from his forehead. What was that?" he rasped. Felipe didn't have time to answer, because behind them something rustled. They were not alone, and whatever lurked inside this chapel was not pleased by their arrival. The rustling didn't stop. Ronnie swallowed air in short, uneven breaths, trying not to panic. Felipe slowly raised the camera and aimed it deeper into the chapel. The flashlight's beam cut through the gloom, revealing an old altar draped in cobwebs. The walls were covered in black mold stains, and scattered across the floor lay ancient, time-darkened candles. "There's no one here," Felipe whispered. Ronnie swallowed hard. Then, "Who just breathed down our necks?" Felipe froze. He spun around sharply, pointing the camera back at the door. Nothing but darkness, but when he glanced at the screen, his heart nearly burst from his chest. There was someone standing right in front of them, a woman. Her face was motionless, her eyes completely black, no whites, no life. A tattered, decayed dress clung to her thin frame, stained with patches of dirt. She didn't move, didn't speak. She was just there. "Oh, shit," Ronnie whispered, stepping back. The woman slowly raised her hand and pointed deeper into the chapel. A cold pressure tightened around Felipe's lungs. She wants us to go that way." Ronnie clenched his fists. "Or maybe she wants us to stay there, forever." The woman didn't move, but when the flashlight's glow touched her face, it only got worse. Her lips started to move. A whisper, silent yet piercing, brushed against their consciousness. "You were never meant to come here." Ronnie gripped Felipe's shoulder. "We're leaving." But the moment they took a step back, the woman vanished, simply dissolved into thin air, and then, with a thunderous slam, the chapel doors shut on their own. "No, no, no, no," Ronnie stammered, rushing toward them. He grabbed the handle, but it wouldn't budge. Felipe stepped closer to the altar, an unnatural chill seeping through his clothes. Something compelled him to look down. Carved into the stone floor were strange symbols, ancient, distorted, etched in something thick and blackened. Blood. And that was when he felt it. Breath, right on his neck. Felipe went rigid. His hands trembled, but somehow he managed to lift the camera. The screen showed what his eyes refused to comprehend. Behind him, mere inches away, stood a shriveled man in a priest's robe. His body was broken, his head tilted at an unnatural angle, and his eye sockets empty. And when the thing smiled, revealing a maw of razor-sharp teeth, the flashlight went out. The last thing Felipe heard was the horrific screech and Ronnie's scream, and then darkness again. The darkness was thick, almost tangible. It pressed against his chest, stealing the air from his lungs, warping reality itself. Felipe collapsed to his knees, gasping for breath. Something was near. He couldn't see it, but he could feel it. The cold, clammy breath of death brushing against his skin. "Ronnie!" He screamed into the void. No answer. His flashlight was dead. The camera had shut itself off. His phone. The screen was black, as if the battery had drained in an instant. Felipe clenched his fists, forcing himself to focus. He had to find Ronnie. Then, suddenly, a faint flicker of light. Candles. They burned all around the chapel, though they hadn't been there moments ago. Their trembling, yellowish flames cast eerie shadows on the walls, shadows that seemed to move on their own. And among those shadows, something new appeared. Figures. Dozens. No, hundreds of people filled the chapel. Their faces were gaunt, twisted with fear and agony. They said nothing. They only stared at him. A chill ran through Felipe's body. "What do you want?" he whispered, barely recognizing his own voice. One of the figures stepped forward. The woman, the same one they had seen before. She opened her mouth and a ragged, breathless wheeze escaped her lips. Then, follow the voice. Felipe stiffened. The voice was not hers. It was Ronnie's. Then, from deep within the chapel, Ronnie's scream tore through the air. Without thinking, Felipe ran, pushing through the silent figures. They slowly drifted aside, parting to create a path. With every step, the candlelight dimmed. He burst into a narrow corridor leading downward, into the crypt. The screams grew louder. He descended. The crypt was worse than the chapel. The air was thick, rancid, filled with something ancient and rotting. Faded inscriptions covered the stone walls. The floor, littered with bones, and there in the center of the horror, Ronnie, frozen in place, his eyes wide with terror. Standing before him was something not human, not just a ghost, something older than death. A dark figure, draped in what resembled a priest's robe, loomed over Ronnie. In its hands, it clutched a massive black cross that pulsed, alive. "Don't touch him!" Felipe shouted, his voice echoing uselessly against the walls. The priest slowly tilted its head. Its face was not human. It was a rotting mask of death. It raised one skeletal hand, and Ronnie was lifted off the ground, writhing in invisible chains. "Stop!" Felipe cried, lunging forward, but he was too late. The darkness thickened. The last thing he saw was Ronnie's eyes turning empty. Ronnie opened his mouth, but it wasn't him anymore. A twisted foreign voice emerged from his lips. "Now, you are next." The candles died, and Felipe was alone with the dark. The darkness was not just the absence of light. It was alive. It breathed. It moved. It whispered, filling the space between reality and terror. Felipe stood frozen in the crypt, where just moments ago his best friend had ceased to be himself. Ronnie no longer moved. He hung in the air, his body unnaturally rigid, as if something held him in invisible chains. His eyes, black voids, from which shadows rose like drifting smoke. Felipe took a step back, his chest tightening with fear. "Ronnie, can you hear me?" The figure of his friend tilted its head slightly, as if listening, then jerked forward. "He is no longer Ronnie." It was not his voice. It was the voice of many merging into a single, distorted whisper. Felipe felt cold terror tighten around his throat. "No, this isn't real." The thing that had been Ronnie raised a hand, and in that instant, something clamped around Felipe's legs. He screamed, struggling to break free, but skeletal hands burst from the ground, gripping him tighter. Their fingers twitched, dry skin stretched over bone. They were pulling him down. Through his cries, he heard a whisper right against his ear. "Give in! Join us! You will never leave!" Felipe forced his hand free, fumbling at his waist. His camera. He turned it on. And the moment the red recording light flashed, everything stopped. The shadows recoiled. Ronnie stiffened, his body trembling as if something inside him was fighting back. Felipe knew this was his only chance. He aimed the camera directly at Ronnie. "If you're in there, if you're still alive, fight! Do you hear me?" Ronnie's body convulsed violently. Suddenly, a deafening scream tore from his throat, but it was not a human scream. A mass of black smoke erupted from him, twisting violently in the air. Behind him, the priestly figure raised its hands, commanding the darkness to return. Felipe didn't hesitate. He grabbed a chunk of stone from the floor and hurled it at the priest with all his strength. The shadowed figure shattered, and suddenly silence. Ronnie collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Felipe rushed to him, gripping his shoulders. "Are you here? Can you hear me?" Ronnie slowly lifted his head. His eyes, they were human again. We have to get out of here," he rasped. Felipe pulled him up, supporting him as they turned toward the exit. The place where the priest had stood was now empty, but from deep beneath the floor, a whisper began to rise. Something else was here. They weren't saved. They had only awakened what had been sleeping. A deep, rumbling growl echoed from the depths of the crypt. Something massive was rising, and they had only one choice. Run. Felipe and Ronnie ran through the darkened crypt, never looking back. Behind them, the deep, guttural rumbling grew louder. Something massive, something terrifying, something rising from the depths. The narrow corridor seemed endless. The walls felt like they were closing in. The air grew heavier, harder to breathe. The flashlight flickered, clinging to its last traces of power. "This place, it won't let us go," Ronnie shouted, nearly tripping. Up ahead, a door, old, wooden, their only chance. Felipe lunged for it, shoving it with all his strength. Locked. "Damn it, help me!" Ronnie slammed his shoulder against the door, but it didn't budge. Behind them, the darkness stirred once more. The ceiling trembled, dust falling from above. Shadows slithered along the walls, whispering, growing, and from deep within the corridor, something began to emerge. Not a man, not a creature, a shadow. Alive, a towering, warped figure with long, almost spider-like limbs dragged itself forward. Its face was a void, a bottomless black pit from which a cold, lifeless whisper slithered out. "You will stay here forever." Felipe's chest tightened. The darkness thickened, clinging to them, suffocating. "We can't breathe." Ronnie wheezed, collapsing to his knees. The shadow reached for them, long, bony fingers stretching, and then a deafening crack. The door swung open on its own. Felipe grabbed Ronnie and dove inside. They hit the cold stone floor. The door slammed shut behind them, sealing away the darkness. Silence. Felipe lay on his back, gasping, staring at the black ceiling. Ronnie panted beside him. Are we alive?" Ronnie rasped. Felipe slowly sat up, scanning the room. Another chamber, old, damp. Gothic arches loomed above them, and in the center, a massive broken stone sarcophagus. Something was inside. Felipe rose to his feet, his breath shallow, and stepped forward. He looked inside and recoiled. A corpse. A priest. The same one. His body was shriveled, mummified, his skin stretched tight over bone. But clutched in his hands, a key. Ronnie groaned, lifting his head. "What is it?" Felipe didn't answer. He reached down and pulled the key free. The priest's eyes snapped open. A guttural moan filled the chamber. The walls shuddered, as if something enormous was tearing through them. "Run!" Felipe shouted. He sprinted to the door, shoved the key into the lock, and turned it. Behind him, something cracked open. The darkness rushed forward, a wave of pure terror. The door flew open. They ran, and they were outside, back in the cemetery. But it wasn't the same. The sky, blood red. The trees twisted, bent toward them as if pulled by unseen hands, and the gates were open. Ronnie staggered forward. "We can get out," he whispered. Felipe didn't move. He knew this wasn't over, because somewhere behind them, among the graves, Footsteps, and this time they were not alone. The cemetery had awakened. Felipe and Ronnie stood before the open gates, but instead of relief, they felt only cold terror. Behind them, something stirred among the twisted graves. The earth trembled, as if an ancient force beneath it had begun to awaken. Stone crosses cracked, deep fissures ran through the soil, and something began to claw its way out. They hadn't just opened an escape for themselves. They had opened it for those who had been trapped here for centuries. "Run!" Felipe shouted, yanking Ronnie forward. They sprinted toward the exit, feeling the weight of something unseen chasing them through the darkness. The whispers grew louder. "Do not leave. You belong to us. You have given us your souls." Felipe clutched the key in his trembling hand, his heart pounding like mad. Ronnie was the first to leap past the gates. Felipe was just inches away from freedom when something clamped around his ankle, a cold, bony hand rising straight from the ground. He screamed, crashing to the dirt, desperately kicking to break free. Ronnie spun around. "Hold on!" He grabbed Felipe's arm, pulling with all his strength, but the hand wouldn't let go. More hands erupted from the soil. Shadowy figures, ghostly silhouettes, countless hungry eyes, all reaching, all pulling, desperate to drag them both back into the abyss. Felipe howled in pain as an unbearable chill seeped into his skin, draining his warmth, his life. Ronnie refused to let go. "No, you won't take him!" Then suddenly he grabbed the camera and hit record. The red light blinked on, and in an instant the hands recoiled. The darkness screamed. Felipe ripped free. They tumbled past the gate, and in the same breath the cemetery gates slammed shut with a deafening boom. Silence, a thick, deathly stillness settled over the ground. They lay there, gasping, unable to believe they were still breathing. Felipe sat up slowly, his fingers still clenched around the camera. He looked at the screen. The recording was still running. He hit play, and they watched. They saw nothing. No ghosts, no shadows. Just the two of them, stumbling through an empty graveyard, screaming, falling, fighting against an invisible enemy, as if nothing supernatural had ever been there. Ronnie wiped the sweat from his face. "Do you see this?" Felipe nodded in silence. They both knew it was real. They had felt it. They had lived it. But now, there was no proof. Nothing but their scars, the ice in their chests, and the horrifying realization that they were still not safe. Felipe lifted his gaze toward the sky, and his stomach turned. The moon was wrong, the stars were wrong, and then he understood. They had left the cemetery, but they had not returned home, and they never would.